This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I am here in the studio. I wasn't actually sure what I was going to use as the topic for today's show until I was going through my normal morning reading. This morning, I came across an article over on a site called The Intercept. It's about a new startup that has created a new innovation that they were all excited about called vocal risk assessment. It uses someone's voice, tone, pitch to assign risk to them. Risks such as, are you trustworthy? Could you become violent? Will you commit fraud? And they claim that they can determine all of this simply by the tone of your voice. Now, as I read the article, it revealed all of the telltale signs of an innovation that is more fluff than real. For instance, the company has extreme paranoia of letting anyone look under the hood to attest that the innovation is real. There's no independent validation. You just have to trust them that when they take a voice and run it through their system and say that person's high risk for being, it's going to cause fraud in your organization, you just have to trust them. Those kinds of claims just really set the hair on the back of my neck on end. As I was skimming the article, it brought back a long list of other innovations, which at first sounded fantastic, but later turned out to be fake, totally bogus, or just plain evil in the way that they could be used or how they were being faked. These included big names like Theranos. Now, Theranos claimed that they had cracked the secret of doing hundreds of tests on single droplets of blood by just taking a single drop, running all of these tests, and at a fraction of the cost. And they were able to convince Walgreens and all of these other companies that they had solved this big problem. Now, in reality, it turns out to have all been bogus. It had all been faked. And in fact, behind the scenes, they were actually using commercial blood testing equipment to do their testing. And they took investors for more than $900 million of investment. That's not valuation. $900 million US dollars in cash, totally on a bogus innovation. Now, in fact, there's a book that just came out called Bad Blood. There's a movie that's coming out that off of that book. And at the Sundance Film Festival, there'll be a documentary on Theranos and the fraud that it perpetrated with its fake innovation. Now, some other big names that we all probably are familiar with, one is Bernie Madoff. Now, Bernie Madoff used to be, if I recall correctly, he was chairman of the NASDAQ for a while. He had his own investment house, and he would take money from all, friends and big name people, and he would also take just off the street people's money. And he was claiming to be returning these absolutely astronomical returns compared to everybody else. And when people tried to poke in on it, he would just simply claim that he had a proprietary approach to trading and that it was a trade secret, and therefore you couldn't look at it, you couldn't validate it. The secret was he was running a Ponzi scheme. His claim of innovation of this proprietary trading algorithms and approaches was totally bogus, totally fake. Now, there's been some smaller ones also. Hampton Creek, which was producing healthy foods. Now, they made science claims that the healthiness of their product met a certain level, and when the FDA finally stepped in and looked at it, guess what? It proved to be totally bogus. Theranos did the same thing. Theranos, at one point, tried to argue that they met the FDA requirements for and the U.S. Department of Health, And then when those departments actually stepped in and looked at it, they were not being compliant, and they, in many cases, had never even applied for any kind of certification. Hampton Creek ended up having the whole thing blow up in their face because they claimed a certain healthiness level to a certain FDA level, and when the FDA came in and checked, it was totally faked. And then there's another smaller one is Zenefits. Zenefits was an employee benefit startup. So if you're not familiar with typically how a lot of startup companies, and particularly there's a high concentration of this in Silicon Valley, small startup companies cannot offer, benefits such as health and insurance and all those kinds of things. So there are these smaller companies that, in effect, aggregate up all the startups together in order to offer, meaningful benefits packages for your employees. Now, Zenefits was a benefits startup claiming that they could do it better and cheaper. And then what they ultimately found out is that they were not even compliant with the law. Their claim of being able to do it cheaper, et cetera, was the fact that the way they would do it was that they just would not be compliant with the law, which reduced their costs. And that's how they claimed to have this ability to be more innovative and more creative. Now, this entire growing scandal of these fake or bogus innovations has really gotten onto my radar screen. It started a couple of years ago with a Wall Street Journal article looking at fake or bogus research results that researchers at universities, et cetera, were purporting, and then they had to have those research studies retracted because they, in effect, just made it up. Now, we could do an entire show on why people feel compelled to cheat and lie. But look, through the history of man, people will cheat and lie. Your task, all of our task is to know when someone is cheating or lying to us. Whether it's someone selling you a car and they're claiming something that it just can't do, or it's a used car and they don't tell you quite everything about it and it turns out to be a lemon, or buying your first house, or whatever it might be. You're in a situation where you're dealing with people. How do you know if someone's cheating or lying? In the case of innovation, for me, this becomes even more important. Now, why? Because the results of some of those innovations could hurt not only the employees, but also it could be very hazardous to consumers, and it could be disastrous to investors, to where people lose confidence in the markets and their willingness to invest. In fact, at the case of Theranos, there's gone to YouTube, you can search for Theranos, there's a bunch of videos, and there's one particular interview where a woman, doctor sent her to have a test at Theranos. It came back with a result that was indicating to her that her cancer had returned. And she ended up with all the stress and this panic, and she had to go for like a week. They went and did some additional testing, and then ultimately the doctor sent this woman to a different clinic to rerun the test to find out that the Theranos results were wrong. Now, could you imagine that if the doctor hadn't done the test but had assumed and started doing all these kinds of invasive procedures? So fake or false innovation, it's not just about, someone lying and cheating in order to make an extra buck. There's implications. There are impacts when people try to get away with faking it or making claims that are unsubstantiated and totally misleading. It's not as simple as, this is a victimless crime. You're impacting real people's lives, real people's jobs, your employees, your investors, your customers. And I think in the case of the innovation industry, we need to hold each other accountable, and we need to raise the bar. Now, can you sniff out these innovations which are fake or bogus? I would say yes. But keep in mind that people who are compelled to cheat and lie will go to extraordinary means to maintain the lie or fraud that are waiting to perpetrate on others. But there are some tells that we can become sensitized to. these tells should cause us to question what is really going on. It doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. So while people will always lie and cheat, by looking for these tells, you can uncover it. So that is the topic for today's show. We're going to answer what are the 4 tells or flags that indicate that you are dealing with a bogus innovation, and therefore should challenge you to look deeper, much deeper, before you get caught in the trap, before you buy in and drink the Kool-Aid. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back after this quick break. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. This week we're discussing the 4 tells or flags that are indicating that you may be dealing with a bogus innovation. The tell number 1 is unvalidated claims. Now, innovations are always promoted with claims that they are the next big thing. They are the thing. Better than sliced bread is always the term I hear. However, claims without validation should be treated with great suspicion. Now, I mean, if you can't get any form of validation, that should be a flag that pops right away. Now, many companies will try to claim that they can't reveal their secret. Now, okay, I get some are overly paranoid. And in fact, in many cases, I will be contacted by startup companies, but before they will say anything, they want me to sign an NDA. And I just cannot do that. I would be signing literally hundreds, if not thousands of NDAs every year. So in my case, I will rarely sign an NDA until I'm convinced with some outside validation that the claims are real. I am not going to just sign blindly on an NDA because then even if you uncover, issues or whatever, you're locked into that NDA. Now, while companies claim that, they don't want to reveal their secrets, and so therefore you just kind of have to trust them, there are ways to treat the technology as kind of a black box, submit some inputs, and then test the outputs. You're not looking at how the magic sauce inside happens, but you're testing that input. They can run it through their magic sauce, but you're measuring and testing the output. So, for instance, in the case of Theranos, they never had their devices tested or validated by doing large sets of test inputs, such as drops of blood, and then output, getting the test results. And you can throw in some control drops to make sure that the data that they're putting in for the drops matches the same results that you would have gotten onto another machine, as an example. Now, if Theranos had done that, if they had run through and done it through an independent lab, somebody that's not Theranos, but somebody that's independent, then those false claims would have been caught much earlier. Now, another flag that is part of this unvalid claims tell is that the company will do anything to protect the information about their own testing and status of the innovation. This shows up in these very onerous non-disclosure agreements, employment agreements, requirements for arbitration agreements, and these organizations will force these upon their staff. And basically, they're creating, the equivalent of CIA or NSA levels of secrecy around their work. Now, I get non-disclosures and non-competes. In some cases, though, when you read what some of these companies have made their employees sign, it's more of the fear factor of you'll be liable for millions of dollars if any information you were shared because of the lost valuation. You could be sued, blah, 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 blah. And they make it unbelievably scary and onerous. And in reality, for instance, in the state of California, some clauses within the non-disclosure agreement or employment agreements are bound by law, and that doesn't prevent the companies from putting those into their agreements under the assumption that the employee will not retain legal counsel and won't get it checked out. They use it purely as a scare tactic in order to try to lock down the information. Now, and in the case of it, if an employee should ever leave, then the legal department of the company typically kicks in to high gear and puts an enormous amount of fear and threat onto that staff person not to reveal anything. So why is this secrecy? Is it really about confidentiality and protecting the information from competitors? There's obviously always that concern, right? But it's really so that the company can create a false narrative. Notice I'm using words very specifically here. Create a false narrative of where that innovation really is on the maturity timeline, right? And they don't want anybody out there spreading, whispering around, they claim X, but it really can't, achieve X. Don't believe that. They want to clamp it down so that there is no leaking, no murmuring, no speaking from the employees that that's true or that's not true. And literally by scaring people to not even share or talk or speak with anybody. Now, there are companies, though, that have done best practices around unvalidated claims. And what you're seeing is after all of these bogus innovations, whether it be Thermos or Madoff or others, that if you go back and just do a simple search on Google, there are some best practices. The first best practice is have test results performed and validated by independent test labs throughout the funding phases. And don't trust just the test results being presented by the innovators who've created the innovation. This is a little bit to keep everybody honest, right? So at each phase of funding, maybe they're claiming 70% accuracy, 80% accuracy, 90% accuracy, and that accuracy improves as the innovation becomes more mature. That's expected. How do you know that? You say, okay, we're going to run 75 tests. Here's the input data. We're going to look for that output data. We're going to seed in that input data some known results so we can make sure that there's no funny business going on. And we're going to give this to an independent lab to observe the testing and validate those results. So have tests performed and validated by independent. And if you are being presented, companies coming to you with this great innovation, ask for that independent test lab result. Ask for them to prove it, not by their own charts and PowerPoint, but by an independent test lab. Secondarily, have senior leaders attest to those test results. Have the CEO and your CTO hold them personally accountable to the validated results, right? It's kind of like, SOX requirements. When I was a CIO post-Enron, I every quarter had to sign for personal liability on a document that our IT systems met to a certain level, and if it was ever found not to meet to that level, I was held personally, financially liable. I was putting my name onto a piece of paper. Where's that level of commitment that we're willing to hold ourselves personally accountable? So we've covered one of the four tells that are indicating that you may be dealing with a bogus innovation. We're going to continue on with the other three. We'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back to the show. So far, we've discussed one of the four tells that are indicating that you may be dealing with a bogus innovation. And let's continue on through the remaining three. Tell number 2, technical oversight. I am actually shocked by the lack of industry and technology experts on boards, both boards of private companies and boards of public companies. With this lack of strong governance of experts, claims by management cannot be validated. There's no way. You don't have anybody on the board to push back and challenge them. In the case of Thermos and Madoff, there were no one providing the role of oversight who had the expertise to understand and challenge what was being claimed. None. Get this, specifically in the case of Theranos, there wasn't one person on the board who had a biomedical and or blood science background. Not one. Therefore, no one could challenge the management team on their claim of progress or achievements. And that is absolutely shocking. Now, we're seeing a lot of drive of including diversity on boards, and I think that's critically important. I think both from a typical definition of diversity, but I'm also a big believer in neurodiversity. How do we think differently? Some of us are linear thinkers, some of us are connection thinkers. You need that variety also on the board, but you also need a diversity of expertise. A lot of boards are stacked with CEOs, retired CEOs, and most of those CEOs either come from sales or they come from finance. They're formerly a CFO, right? You're finding less and less people on the board who have a technical background. And sad to say, that even applies in Silicon Valley. People tend to want to stack their boards with lots of people with big names, but they lack that technical expertise. So what's best practice in this case? Best practice is have people on the board with deep technical expertise who are, quote, independent, and this is critical, independent of the innovation. What do I mean by independent of the innovation? Meaning they are not the inventor, such as the founders or the creators of the intellectual property. They have no previous connection to the innovation that is core to the company, right? So you want a board member with deep technical expertise who are independent of the innovation, meaning they're not the inventors, right? So they don't have a bias towards, oh, this is my innovation. How dare you challenge it? I know it works. You want an independent technical expert. Now, there are independent board members, right? By law, you're required to have an independent board members on public companies, or you need to declare an independent board member, somebody who's not part of management, didn't retire from the company, etc. I would say we need an independent technical member of the board, somebody not tied to the technology, but who can understand it and push back and challenge it. And then an alternative, if you don't have a technical member on the board, is to have a science and technology advisory board who is incentivized to investigate and validate the claims. A lot of science and technology advisory boards, and look, I'm on a couple of these, they start off as just window dressing, right? They just want to have some big names on an advisory board. I won't accept those. If someone asks me to join their advisory board and I sniff it out that it's just window dressing, pass, go get somebody else, right? So either you need to have somebody on the board who has deep technical expertise, or you need to have a science and technology advisory board that is real, that is incentivized to investigate and validate the claims, not just window dressing. So tell number 2, technical oversight. Tell number 3, this is going to sound silly. It seems obvious to me. But tell number 3 is fact-checking. Many of the organizations caught in innovation fraud are found to make claims that if you just simply fact-check them, would have been an early signal that something was amiss. For instance, many biomedical companies will claim claims of FDA approval, when in fact they're kind of dancing loose with what that means. Depending on your device, depending on where you are in the industry, you can go through the process of an FDA approval, but that is typically pretty rare, and they don't disclose that on what level of an FDA approval. And that's just one of many examples of where companies will make a claim of some government endorsement when it really is not there. In another instance, they'll claim customers who are using the innovation in a brochure or on a website or in a verbal conversation. In the case of Theranos, there were claims that the Department of Defense was using their innovation in the field, in the battlefield. A simple fact check would have proven that false. So what is best practices? Now, this is going to sound a little strange. I'm stealing some of this from my journalist side of what I do, and that is hire top professional fact checkers and have them go through each and every claim being presented by the company. In my case, when I was writing my book, starting back in 2010, I hired this New York-based fact checker, this woman. I'm telling you, she was unbelievably good. There's one story in the book where we talk about Apollo 13, and it was when they had to hurry up and make the air scrubber and do this modification with duct tape and plastic bags and pieces of cardboard. In that description, we commented on the fact that they had to use a rag. She came back and said, nope, it was not a rag. It was actually a sock. And we had to correct the book in order to make sure that it was completely accurate. Having that kind of ability to have somebody go through and fact check every claim. So if someone's trying to get you to invest, someone's trying to get you to buy, hire a fact checker to literally go through every claim, every customer, talk to every customer they've claimed they've sold to, etc. Any claims proven to be misleading or false should be made public and corrected. If you're the company and you make a claim, you should have your information fact-checked before you put it out there. And if you put it out there and it's wrong, stand up to it, correct it, and note the updates, right? Companies who want to maintain a high level of credibility should consider hiring and supporting a corporate version of the ombudsman now found in most top media companies. These are the people who are the point of contact for outsiders who have claims of false or misleading information. So ombudsmen at the New York Times, for instance, if you're in an article or you see an article and you think that that article is incorrect, you have a direct line to the ombudsman to report that, and the ombudsman's obligated to investigate it. And the ombudsman's independent. They're not part of the editorial staff. They're not part of it. They report directly to the senior executives within the organization, and it's really that ability for people to raise their hand and yell bogus and for an investigation to happen. Ombudsmen is a great role. Like I said, we're seeing this in media companies. I would love to see it, particularly in high-tech companies, larger high-tech companies. You think about having an ombudsman at Facebook or an ombudsman at Google or an ombudsman or at HP, where someone could come in and say, hold on here a second, you claimed X. What's really the story? Otherwise, the person has to call customer support or try to even get a phone number. Try to find a phone number for Google or Facebook to call. There's no customer support. And when you send an email, you're lucky if you'll ever get an answer, right? Who is the ombudsman for those organizations where if you want to do the fact checking and you claim that something is not accurate with what they're doing or what they're doing is not right, who do you report that to? So again, best practices for fact checking is hire that fact checker. I can tell you from my own personal experience of using fact checkers, they are worth every dollar you spend in protecting you for anything that may come down the line later on. And I am really interested in this concept of ombudsmen to get that role as a regular role in companies so that people have a way to raise their hand and say, hey, something's not right. So we've covered 3 or 4 of the tells. We've got more to go. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back to the show. So far, we've discussed 3 of the 4 tells that are indicating that you may be dealing with a bogus innovation. So what is number 4? Number 4 is organizational governance. Many of the companies that have been caught in innovation fraud have had stellar individuals on the board. This is how they perpetrate the fraud. Once a CEO has recruited a few big names to the board, everyone else joining convinces them that, quote, Jack must have looked deep into the technology, the management team, and the claims, else he wouldn't have joined. So therefore, since he was in first, he must have looked at it really deep, so it must be safe. I'll just go ahead and invest. I don't need to do it. This is what I call due diligence by proxy. I've had personal experience in this one. Now, after my retirement from Teligent, this is late 90s, early 2000, fixed wireless. I was one of the first members of the management team. We grew that up and did an IPO, and I exited out. It was kind of my first big cash out. Now, after I retired from Teligent, I was invited by some big-name investors to join them on a few boards of startups that they had invested in. Now, as I looked into it, it actually became quickly obvious that no one, zero of those board members had done any due diligence about any of the claims made by these startups. And it was shocking at how little to no due diligence was done by these big name investors. And in one case, one of the board members, the late senator and vice presidential candidate Jack Kemp, was on 23 startup boards. This group of big name investors had invited me to join the board on one or two of their early stage startups. Jack was one of those board members. And when I got to talking to Jack and got to know him, he was on, again, 23 startup boards. How does anybody serve on 23 boards, right? I've been on public boards, I've been on private boards, I've been on nonprofit boards, I've done it all, right? And the most that I've ever been able to do is 3, and even then, 3 while you're holding down a high-profile job such as CTO at HP or the CEO at Cable Labs as I am now, that's almost impossible. And in fact, nowadays, with my current role as a CEO, I'm not on any board of directors of anything, nonprofits or anything at this point. But Jack was on 23 boards. I stepped in and got to know Jack really, really well, and I sat down with him and advised him that he was lending his name and reputation to companies that flat out did not warrant that level of trust. All you have is your credibility. And when you join a board, when you join an advisory board, you are lending them your name and your credibility. And so I worked with Jack. We worked out a process. We reduced his board participation down to 5, and only in ones where the innovations were real and they were aligned with his personal goals, such as, education in America and rural startup companies. And, Jack had his personal passion areas. But we made sure that he was only on the boards that had real innovations, real governance, validated results, all the things I'm talking about here in order for him to be successful. So the best practice is ensure that each person on the board has done its own due diligence and is not depending on board member reputation as a proxy. Secondarily, review board participation for each board member to ensure they are fully behind the company and not just lending their names. If someone says they're on 20 boards, they're not providing any oversight. It's very hard for them to provide the fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. So in closing, I'm growing more and more concerned about the growing list of bogus, fake, false innovations and the harm they can do to investors, employees, and, I pray that companies think about this or innovators think about this, but the customers. Can your innovation hurt somebody because of the bogus, fake claims that people are making? So keep your eyes open and be on the lookout for the foretells that the innovation you are looking at may not be all that it's made out to be. Remember, tell number 1 is unvalidated claims. Tell number 2 is technical oversight. Tell number 3 is fact-checking, just simple fact-checking. And tell number 4 is organizational governance. Now, my hope is you found this information useful to you in your organization. If you have examples, comments, or you want to discuss this further, this is a big area of passion for me, join me over at the Innovators community. You can just go over to theinnovators.community. It's a free community of innovators, designers, creatives, futurists, and it's where I hang out every day and where we can collectively go deeper on topics like this bogus innovation. Because I think we as innovators and those of us who are passionate about innovation, the ball's in our court. What are we going to do to raise the bar and the expectations of all innovators, not to get caught up in the lying and the fraud and creating these bogus innovations? So again, innovators.community if you want to continue the conversation. And with that, we are going to be a Consumer Electronics Show this year. So if you're going to be in Las Vegas at CES, let me know. Again, you can get all of the information on where we're going to be over at theinnovators.community. If you enjoyed this episode, can I ask a favor? Share it with somebody. Each time you share it, it creates an opportunity for us to grow our subscriber base. And also, don't forget about our sponsors. In this case, Zoom. Go over, check it out, use it. Let Zoom that you've heard about them from here at the show. That helps us a lot, and we greatly appreciate our sponsors. Also, hop on over wherever you get your podcasts and give us a rating. And don't forget, you can always get the show notes over at killerinnovations.com, including the list of these 4 tells and all of the information that we share in today's episode. And with that, I want to just say thank you for joining us today. Stay in touch. Don't let the innovation antibodies get you down. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.